Okay, there we are. So we're going to talk about storyboarding. So what are the lesson goals when you storyboard? You want to understand why storyboards are used in planning comic books, and you want to be able to create a storyboard suitable for your own comic book. That's our goal today. Now, are storyboards used for other things? Absolutely 100%. Yes, they are. So when, Tim Cook goes on the stage over at, Apple and starts introducing new projects or new, devices, all every movement, when the lights go up, when anything happens, when sound comes in, all of those things are storyboarded. So storyboarding is a process of producing sketches of the shots of your script. The end result looks like a comic book of your story without any speech bubbles. Do you have to be a good artist? No, not really. You can be, but looking at storyboards by Hitchcock or Spielberg, you have to admit that they couldn't draw. They hired professional storyboard artists that could give the results that they wanted for their final stories. So there's lots of jobs for this, believe it or not. So here's an image of a storyboard, of course, in some of my favorite movies, Star Wars, and there we can see what we call a close-up of, or a mid shot really, of one of the stormtroopers, and then the other they're flying. So what are storyboards used for? So they're used as a way of planning what you're going to make before you actually have to make it. Storyboards allow you to see how a storyline will flow through a comic book, and they can also let you place characters and speech bubbles in the panels to plan it out. So this is an example of a panel page and different kinds of panels. This is quite a few panels on one page. I'm certainly not going to require that. And down at the bottom, you'll notice that there's different kinds of speech bubbles, and we'll be talking about those as well. So a typical comic book layout is A is a panel, B is a borderless panel. So you can have a panel with a border or without. The gray areas are what are called gutters, and the green areas is the tier. It is a single row of panels. So they're like exactly, the same. Notice the other ones change. So terminology. We have different terminologies. We have the panels, we have what's called a spread, and we also have a splash page. So a panel is an individual frame or drawing, single drawing in the multiple panel sequence of a comic book. A panel consists of single drawing depicting a frozen moment. When multiple panels are present, they are often, though not always, separated by a short amount of space called a gutter. The spread, that's the center one. That's an image that spans more than one page. You can do this when we get into InDesign, and it really looks good. They've done a great job over at Blurb, which is the company that will be producing our books. And you can drag your artwork all the way over into multiple pages. And there you see some real interesting, into 2 pages. So you can see some really interesting ways that they laid their panels out. They're not just little squares. There's like this big action happening in the center, and then the panels are sort of interestingly shaped. And when we get into InDesign, you'll note that the frames that you put your artwork into, you can use your direct selection tool, and you can actually change the sizes and make them, like this, where they've kind of got pointed angles and they're not necessarily square. And then a splash page. A splash page is a large, often full-page illustration which opens and introduces a story. In this case, we're looking at a cover. Often designed as a decorative unit, its purpose is to capture the reader's attention and can be used to establish what we call time, place, and mood. Speech bubbles. So there's different kinds of speech bubbles. A rounded or irregularly shaped outline, as in a cartoon or other drawing containing words that represent a character's speech, and often featuring a tail that points to who the speaker is. It's often called a speech balloon. So there you can see the speech, what you would put in, and then an afterthought, like they paused and then said something else. So there we can see we have another bubble connected to the other bubble saying extend. So that's a way to think about that. The next one is called a thought bubble, or, well, in our case, we call it internal monologue. So, what am I thinking? A shape resembling a cloud or a balloon connected to the character by a chain of increasingly smaller circles. Rather than having an entire tail, we have all these little circles. And we enclose the text into that space, and it represents a character's thought. A caption, or I like to call it a transition box, is a really good way to move things in time. Sometimes you don't, like say, for example, you're driving out to California and you've got this whatever 1,000-mile drive. You're not going to go every single page with, 7 different panels and say, okay, we stopped here and we stopped at this wayside. And if nothing's happening, you'll say, on the road, or now on the road, or, meanwhile, or something like that. And then you get them to the place that they're going to be, or where the next action thing is going to happen in the next frame or in the next page. So in a caption, words appear in a box separated from the rest of the panel or page, usually to give voice to a narrator, but sometimes it's often used by characters' thoughts and even dialogue. In some comics where speech balloons are not used, a caption can provide the reader with text about what is happening in the image. Think of it like in Star Wars in the very beginning, how we have the speech that goes off in space and it goes into like kind of a perspective. And it's basically setting you up for what this part of the story is about, because obviously there's many, many, many episodes in Star Wars. It's also, again, called or used as a transition box. Although one thing that's different is that in older comic books, most of the time when you use a transition box like this to be continued, you would have that box be yellow or light green. And you don't have to do that, but that's very common. Okay. There's other graphic symbols that are often used when making your comic book. So it's called symbolia. Is like in this case, we see the cartoonist used to represent a host of physical and psychological conditions like shock, surprise, any of those kinds of things. And they can emanate from around the person's head or body. And there's agitrons, squiggly lines suggesting instability, dizziness, or sickness. And there you can see a variety of them. So there we've got some little beads of sweat popping off the forehead. We've got that like little cyclone, could be confusion, any of those kinds of things. The next are called motion lines, and those are also known as movement lines, and they just make things move faster. So we can see like behind the jet in the corner, there's lines coming off of him, and maybe they're chemtrails, but let's just say they're not. Let's just say they're movement lines. Also, we can see, all the people sort of jumping and dancing in the street or whatever they're doing over there. And above them are a whole series of lines. So they're sort of abstract lines that appear behind a moving object or person, parallel to its direction of movement, and make it appear as if they're moving quickly. And then sound effects. So sound effects are really great. And these are just words that we play with and do, have some fun things with, to be able to make it appear kind of like the sound. So sound effects are loaded with more information than just the thing sounds like. Among the diversity of form and function, they can often clarify the events in a panel by enhancing an action that is hard to capture in just a still image. So if, this motorcyclist or bicyclist in the other image, if he were just going to hit a stone, it might be, thoop, or, some kind of crunch, and then boom, off the bike, right? So a sound might suggest a degree or severity, for example, of an impact. So how to do a rough storyboard. So a storyboard is a combination of text, dialogue, and graphic presented in a nonlinear format in which the information in each medium is complementary, not redundant to your story. The first thing to tackle is the part about the story being nonlinear. And this is something that right now you've been laying your story out in a kind of linear fashion. And the way I think about linear, it'd be like, okay, let's go on a date. And in our first date, you sit down and you ask someone, well, tell me something about yourself. And they go and say, well, I was born in da da da, and I was born in this city, and my parents did this, and then like when I was 1 year old, we moved here, and then went into da da da, and then like 7 hours later, after they've linearly laid out their entire story of their life, every mundane moment of it, you're just like, okay, that's that, and it's not very interesting. So a lot of times we can think about how stories work, and do we always start at the beginning of the story? And so a lot of you right now are probably starting at some sort of a beginning, but I want to challenge you that at this point in the game, could you flip that around? So for example, could be you as an older person remembering something that happened in your younger life? Could it be, a very young person and having a premonition about something that happens later on? Could you go back and forth in time? Could your time be, at different intervals? Why you're doing something, and then you go back to a memory, right? So it just makes the story more full, and it's really how we act. We don't always think about everything in a completely linear fashion. We're thinking about what's going to happen in the future and what happened in the past and how it's affecting the moment. And so that's why I'm trying to challenge you to how are you really laying a story out? Is it completely linear, or can it be non-linear? So your task is to create an original storyboard for the comic book showing layout panels of characters, speeches, and headings. Your storyboard should be put together with all of these elements in mind. Divide the story into logical, nonlinear parts, such as a lead or nut paragraph, essentially addressing why this story is important. So at the very big top of your story, before you even begin your panel script, you want to have a paragraph that says, this is who I am. This is what this story is about. Boy meets girl. Girl doesn't like boy. Boy breaks his back trying to get girl to like him. In the end, girl doesn't like boy. I don't know. I'm just being facetious, but it could be anything like that, like something that you're going to tell quickly. One short paragraph. The profiles of the main people. So kind of a little bit about each one. Now you already did that in your character analysis, so you can shorten that to 2 or 3 sentences, right? Because you know your characters now. The event or situation. What's the big event? What's the big thing that happens? Is it like a salvation story? Does Superman save the world again? What is it all does Spider-Man get the bad guys? I mean, what is going on here? This is important. How any process or how something works. So for example, Superman has X-ray vision. A lot of times when we look in comic books, how do we see, or even other things like in movies, like what kind of CG, what do we do to make that work? What happens with the lightsaber? How does that work? And so like in the X-ray vision, we normally see sort of red coming out of his eyes, going to the object that he's seeing through. Right? So that's the process of how something works. So you want to have, like, if there's anything like that in your story, if there's like somebody who's got, disjoints and they can like move any direction, you want to describe that. Rubber Man. Good and bad things about your story. What's the pros and cons? Is there anything you don't like about your story right now? Put it in there. It's really important because maybe it's a way we can fix that. The history of the event or situation. This doesn't go necessarily in your actual comic book. It's just a background that So like for example, at the beginning of Star Wars, like we kind of get caught up because we have this quick history. And then instead of thinking this part, first part, second part, third part, fourth part, think this part, that part, another part. So again, like talking about getting it out of that linear space. And there's lots of help guides that I have online when it goes to script writing, and they'll say sometimes put different parts of your story on note cards and then kind of lay them out and mess them up, and then pull them out one at a time and see if you can make the story more interesting by like changing up the way you're telling the story. So it should be that part, another part, and yet another part. It helps to avoid linear thinking. The homepage comprises a headline, nut paragraph, an establishing visual, and links to other parts, which are usually the subtopics of the overall story. So let's take a look at how panels would like work. So in this case, we have a flow, and we've got, we can't even read what she's saying, but I want you to kind of just look at it. And what we see is a young girl holding what looks to be a baby and looking up at this eagle. And there we see her brown eyes and at the top, and we see her brown eyes have like a reflection of the eagle in her eyes. And then we see another image of a older woman with the same brown eyes and the same reflection of the eagle. And then we see the woman looking up at the eagle, and then we see the woman holding something in her hand that looks to be black, and then we go right to the next. So what is it? There we see a picture of a young man, and then we see a memory. And there she is talking to the young man. But do you see the setup here? So we have a flow. We kind of come in and we have what we call hierarchy. So like a hierarchy of the imagery. So here we see the eagle is all by itself. So when we first look at the image, most likely we're going to look at that eagle and then look down and see the girl and then come back up to the next row of images and off again. Here's another interesting sequence. So here we have, looks like a showdown at OK Corral, right? And it's like set up like with just comic characters, like kind of a Western scene. But look at the angle of the shot. We do not see the whole character. All we see is his feet. And then in the great distance, because we've got all this perspective going on, we see the other guy, the bad ice cream cone. And then we move down, and what do we see is a expression of the ice cream cone. And then we see something, a silhouette, and then we see the eyes like, ooh, angry, and da-da-da-da, movement lines, and there they're coming in, and they're going to save the day. So we have this really interesting flow. And we don't have perfectly square panels, and we don't have, like we have one panel on top of another, and we don't have perfect gutters and all of that. And that's fine. You don't need all of it doesn't need to be. In fact, sometimes when they're perfect little squares, they're very, very boring. So this is the part where you get to design how it's going to get laid out. Now this is all in German. And so again, we can't read it, but let's look at the action. What can we know from not even reading the script? Now, remember how some of the panels don't have lines around them? So in this particular artist, the way they're working, it's kind of like a watercolor look, and it's all in grayscale. And we just see like a part of the panel being drawn around, and another part of it is open. It just sort of opens up to like a space. So we see the handshake. We kind of move over to the top. We see them talking. We go down. There's a problem. So we see expression on the face. And the next thing you know, we're looking at cars and somewhere where they're like not being able to, we don't see them. So sometimes you can have, as long as you know somebody's there and you're following the storyline, you can have like a background scene and not see the character at all, and have a bubble that goes back into an area that you know that's that character. So you don't even have to put the character in the shot. So let's talk about shots, because I keep using words like shot. And what does shot mean? So there's different kinds of shots. So this is what we call a wide shot. And here we have Superman, and he's in a tractor beam, and he looks like he's in trouble, doesn't he? So the name for a shot, which is taken from a long, long way away, people look quite small in this shot, and we see a lot of what's going on in the outside scene. So everything that we want to see is like happening all the way around. That audience can see what sort of place the scene is in. And so we can kind of get an emotional content. So is it safe? Is it not safe? It doesn't look safe to me. It looks like he's in trouble. So here's another similar. And then we have this big wide shot, like everything's blown up. And there's Clark Kent down holding the little girl. And we really can't see his expression on his face. So the next, and I like using movies for this, because movies are a good way to look at the way they do their shot sequences for you to be able to say, oh, okay, I understand now. So we want to know, like, wow, what's happening? This doesn't look good. And the next shot, this is the next scene in the movie. And there he is. He's determined. He's going to get him. So that would be a close-up of his face, and that gives us expression. That's when you use a close-up, is when you want to show how someone feels about something, We don't need a speech bubble. We can see it. A picture tells 1,000 words. That's why doing this helps you define your visual thinking. Doing this comic book really helps you define that. So a long shot. So a long shot is not as wide as a wide shot, but it still gives us the space in the room. So the closer than the wide shot, you can see the person from head to toe, but you can still see what's around them, and it's just a little bit closer, right? So of course, because Superman, we love Superman. So here we have, he's got around all his favorite stuff, watching his favorite show. All right, so the next one is called a medium shot. And this shows when someone just below their waist or at their waist to just above their head. And when you use a medium shot, you're close enough to see the people's expression, but you also can see what they're doing with their hands. And this is important. So a lot of times you want to show that process, and that process will be a punch in her case. She's got her glove off and she's ready to punch somebody, right? So she's, you know, really in this active moment. Close-up. So a close-up, this shows the head of the person being filmed or drawn. You can use this sort of shot when it's important to see someone's expression, for example, if they're scared or angry or happy or whatever. So here's some more angles of different ways to put, you know, comic books together. And now, are you going to have to draw this kind of extensive drawing in your mock-up book? Absolutely not. You can even just take notes. But what we have here is this wide, kind of wider shot, or long shot somewhat, but he's in the foreground. So notice that we have people kind of in the background that we can see more of. And then we have a person even coming off the screen. And then he's in a mid shot. So all in one comic, we have multiple things going on, right? Because you have multiple people. Now that's pretty complicated. You probably won't go quite to that extent, but you could have that kind of a shot because it's wide, right? You're going at like a 9:16 sort of format. And then if we come down, he's got an aha moment, and he's, you know, close up. And then we have a close up of whatever he's holding there. Looks like diamonds and pearls. And then he's having a conversation. And then I like this bottom one a lot because I love this sound effect. And it looks like there's maybe a fight going on. And there's people afraid and people running and look out and I'm getting out of here, kind of go, go, go. And then the bottom is like this sort of clouds and people, like little silhouettes of people like actually having some kind of fight. And there's a guy like kind of falling right over the top of the sound effects. So it's pretty cool. Here's a fight scene. I would never expect you to go to all the trouble to draw a fight scene in a comic book, but I think it's worth it to take a look at it. So there at the top, we have our transition. Remember how I said they're like in old time comic books, they're almost always yellow. And here we have the action. So we go from boom to boom. He gets hit, he goes back, you know, and Captain America starts. And then in the end, they're both exhausted. Okay. So what kind of shot do we have here? Anybody guess? Just turn your mic on and say, Mario, what do you think?
It's a medium shot.
Well, it's medium for the
establishing, yeah, because the toys are giants. So
yeah,
we're looking at what's happening with Superman there.
Yeah, so it could be, it's that same sort of situation like that one other shot. We have medium of the character of the villains, but actually a long shot of Superman. So kind of interesting, and that I want to show you that you know, it's not black and white. It's not just one or the other. You know, it really depends on how you're thinking. And then of course, oh boy, Superman's in trouble, isn't he? We're really in trouble. He's gonna just get hammered here. Maybe not. So there's our, you know, close up of Superman's face, and Superman's got a plan. Okay, so this is how you move your imagery. You move it from what's the problem to what's the plan, what's the expression, what's the emotion, and that's what makes a good comic book. This is a great shot. This is a splash page kind of shot, and I love this for lots of reasons. So he's breaking out from, you know, the kryptonite, and he's got all of this glass and everything else, and he's just busting all out of it. And notice how they use the glass in perspective, and they've got all of it flying, and yet at the same time there's like a sense of movement, because even the glass itself has little movement lines in it, and there's just this sort of big array of stuff that's happening all around him. So pretty cool. This is an interesting shot because we can see where it's layered up, and they just used like a gradient and took the character probably from another part of the thing and just laid it behind Superman. So you can see where there's like the first layer, the second layer, the third layer, and then the gradient background. Kind of interesting to like how you can build up a splash page. And you can tell a story in one image. What's happening in this image? Mario, what do you think's happening here?
I think they're going on their first date.
And it looks like maybe Superman finally is getting married to Lois Lane, right? Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
How many editions of comic books have we been waiting for poor Lois Lane? Well, you got to remember, Superman is a very, very, very old comic book. It goes way back. And so I thought it would be interesting to show you an old comic book cover. So there we have Superman's girlfriend, Lois Lane. Death waits to kiss the bride. Lois killed on our honeymoon, and it's my fault. Oh. And that's when comic books by DC only cost 20 cents, right? So look at how interesting this cover page is. We've got Superman, dead center, Lois Lane, obviously problematic here. Down at the bottom, we have all the other superheroes from DC. And plus, there's another added thing about Rose and the Thorn and the Edge of Madness. And then we have our price and our title. And what I think is interesting is the title is right at the top. Do you ever think about that? Like, why would the title be at the top of the page always? Well, sometimes titles aren't at the top of the page anymore. But back then, titles were always at the top of the page. Do you know why, Mario?
Yeah, you put them in a comic book spinner, and you had to see what the title it was because you couldn't see all the covers.
Yeah, you couldn't see all the covers. So every little bit of the cover had to attract you in. So it started with, oh, this is about Superman's girlfriend, Lois Lane. So then, okay, then you pull it up and you look at the whole cover, you pull it out of the rack, and then and then you get all this other stuff, and this little red, like, so you can see how they put little words in, he's talking, all of that. Again, this idea of special effects, like how do you create special effects? So here's Superman with his X-ray eyes. So he's plowed through hundreds of square miles of snow into the air. It's time to pour on the heat vision. And then transition boxes. You can use them in lots of different ways. You can use them as, telling parts of the story. So we have like one part of the image, and notice even the buildings. You remember what I said about you don't have to use your whole background? So here we just see kind of a corner of one of them and some background building, but mostly it's sky and a little bit of clouds and our two characters. This other one, we've got the, sky, the clouds around part of the earth, some lines, and that's it, space. And then also, remember how I said a lot of times you don't need any background at all? So here's a conversation. So here we have, we're looking down on the person we're talking with. I think this is Clark Kent, and there he is looking down at the editor, and the editor's telling him something. And now they're having this conversation. And notice the little silhouettes, and all we have is orange. And then the next one, he's reading something, and all we have is green, right? We don't see anything else in the room. It's like you don't need to have. It's all about, and you already built these 3/4 images, so the 3/4 faces and so forth. So you're ready to start doing any of this. You could see how quickly you could pull this together. And then here we have both back images, and their heads are slightly turned. And again, it's just like a quote unquote doorway. We don't even care. We don't know. A little smoke coming from a cigar. But other than that, there's no real background until we get to the last image, and then this outside of a building. And there you can see they're using that 3-point perspective, so you can see the top of the building. So very cool. Here's, again, same thing. Look at these backgrounds. There's hardly anything in the backgrounds. Just movement lines, because he's working with this, slippery character, and he's trying to get his hands on him. And so he keeps going, like try to find him. And there at the bottom, we've got you know, Superman sort of reaching up and all we see is a part of a leg. You know, here they are running again. And if we look at this character's, you know, the way his legs are spread like that, we can see it all over the place. You know, it's like we just keep moving him around. You know, there's his feet again. You know, he's got this multi-jointedness. And then, of course, you know, the cover. And we're going to have a whole section on talking about covers. I don't want you to worry about the cover just yet, but I want you to think about it. And covers are really interesting things. And you can go back into old-time comic books. I love this, you know, this is very old. This is probably one of the oldest, you know, covers. And at the same time, look at the drawing style and how the drawing style of these characters changed over time. I just think it's pretty impressive and very interesting. Do you have anything to add to that, Mario, about that kind of thing?
No, well, this is a first issue. It had a Adventure Comics was his home base for a while, and he became successful. So they started Superman Comics, and the differences in the character are caused by different artists drawing the character at different times, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
They really reflect the mood of the decade that they're in.
Yeah.
You'll have you know, this one was in the 30s. In the 40s, he was fighting Nazis. In the 50s, you know, you got the stories of Lois Lane and the antics of Jimmy Olsen. You know, in the 60s, it became social awareness. So that's what's going on most of the covers, that type of thing.
So, you know, again, when we get to the end of this all, you know, the bottom line is that when you do your storyboard, you can do it with stick figures. You can write next to the stick figure, big circle face with a sad frown on it. You know, Superman's expression, sad. You can do that in your mock-up book. It just gives you a guide. You should not be putting a lot of effort into drawing these. You just want to do a sort of layout as to what's going to be what and when you're going to turn a page and so on. So in the end, you know, it's all about you kind of breaking the chains of your own imagination and just trying to figure out how you can make the very best comic book you can and how to make it as interesting as possible and give yourself a challenge. You know, otherwise Lois Lane might just be on your tail. I don't know. So that's the end of our show. And I hope that you enjoyed it. And let me go to the last screen and stop.